"I suppose you'll be writing your memoirs now," said one of the first Americans I met in Flensburg in 1945. Since then, 24 years have passed, of which I spent 21 in a prison cell. A long time. Now I am publishing my memoirs. I have tried to describe the past as I experienced it. Many will think it distorted. Many will find my perspective wrong. That may or may not be so. I have set forth what I experienced and the way I regard it today. In doing so, I have tried not to falsify the past. My aim has been not to gloss over either what was fascinating or what was horrible about those years. Other participants will criticize me, but that is unavoidable. I have tried to be honest. One of the purposes of these memoirs is to reveal some of the premises which almost inevitably led to the disasters in which that period culminated. I have sought to show what came of one man's holding unrestricted power in his hands, and also to clarify the nature of this man. In court at Nuremberg, I said that if Hitler had any friends, I would have been his friend. I owe to him the enthusiasm and the glory of my youth, as well as belated horror and guilt. In the description of Hitler, as he showed himself to me and to others, a good many likable traits will appear. He may seem to be a man capable and devoted in many respects, but the more I wrote, the more I felt that these were only superficial traits. For such impressions are countered by one unforgettable experience, the Nuremberg trial. I shall never forget the account of a Jewish family going to their deaths. The husband, with his wife and children on the way to die, are before my eyes to this day. In Nuremberg, I was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. The military tribunal may have been faulty in summing up history, but it attempted to apportion guilt. The penalty, however poorly such penalties measure historical responsibility, ended my civil existence. But that scene had already laid waste to my life. It has outlasted the verdict of the court. January the 11th, 1969, Albert Speer. Inside the Third Reich. Chapter 1: Origins and Youth. Some of my forefathers were Swabians. Some came from poor peasants of the Westerwald, others from Silesia and Westphalia. They belonged to the great mass of those who lived quiet, unnotable lives. There was one exception. Hereditary Reich Marshal Count Friedrich Ferdinand zu Pappenheim, 1702 to 1793, who begot 8 sons with my unmarried ancestress Hummelin. He does not, however, seem to have worried much about their welfare. 3 generations later, my grandfather, Hermann Hommel, son of a poor forester in the Black Forest, had become by the end of his life sole owner of one of the largest machine tool firms in Germany and of a precision instrument factory. In spite of his wealth, he lived modestly and treated his subordinates well. Hard-working himself, he knew how to let others work without interfering. A typical Black Forest brooder, he could sit for hours on a bench in the woods without wasting a word. My other grandfather, Berthold Speer, became a prosperous architect in Dortmund about this same time. He designed many buildings in the neoclassical style of the period. Though he died young, he left enough to provide for the education of his 4 sons. The success of both my grandfathers was furthered by the rapid industrialization of Germany, which began in the second half of the 19th century. But then many persons who had started out from a better basis did not necessarily flourish. My father's mother, prematurely white-haired, inspired in me more respect than love in my boyhood. She was a serious woman, moored fast to simple notions about life and possessing an obstinate energy. She dominated everyone around her. I came into the world in Mannheim at noon on Sunday, March the 19th, 1905. The thunder of a spring storm drowned out the bells of a nearby Christ church, as my mother often used to tell me. In 1892, at the age of 29, my father had established his own architectural firm. He had since become one of the busiest architects in Mannheim, then a booming industrial town. He had acquired a considerable fortune by the time he married the daughter of a prosperous Mainz businessman in 1900. The upper middle class style of our apartment in one of his Mannheim houses was commensurate with my parents' status. It was an imposing house, built around a courtyard guarded by elaborate wrought iron gates. Automobiles would drive into this courtyard and stop in front of a flight of stairs which provided a suitable entrance to the richly furnished house. But the children, my two brothers and I, had to use the back stairs. These were dark, steep and narrow, and ended unimpressively in a rear corridor. Children had no business in the elegant, carpeted front hall. As children, our realm extended from our bedrooms in the rear wing to a vast kitchen. We had to pass through the kitchen to enter the elegant part of the 14-room apartment. From a vestibule with a sham fireplace faced with available Delft tiles, guests were conducted into a large room full of French furniture and Empire upholstery. The glittering crystal chandelier particularly is so impressed on my memory that I can see it to this day. So is the conservatory, whose appointments my father had bought at the Paris World Exhibition in 1900. Richly carved Indian furniture, hand-embroidered curtains, and a tapestry-covered divan. Palms and other exotic plants suggested an exotic world. Here my parents had their breakfast, and here my father would make ham rolls for us children of the kind that were eaten in his native Westphalia. My recollection of the adjacent living room has faded, but the panelled neo-Gothic dining room has kept its magic for me. The table could seat more than 20. There my baptism was celebrated. There our family festivals take place to this day. My mother took great pleasure and pride in seeing to it that we belonged socially to the leading families of Mannheim. There were surely no more, but no less than 20 or 30 households in the city that enjoyed comparable luxuries. A large staff of servants helped meet the requirements of status. In addition to the cook, whom for obvious reasons we children were especially fond of, my parents employed a kitchen maid, a chambermaid, a butler frequently, and a chauffeur always, as well as a nanny to look after us. The maids wore white caps, black dresses, and white aprons. The butler, purple livery with gilt buttons. The chauffeur was dressed most magnificently of all. My parents did their best to provide a happy childhood for us, but wealth and status, social obligations, the large household, the nanny, and the servants stood in the way of their doing as they wished in this respect. To this day, I can feel the artificiality and discomfort of that world. Moreover, I often had dizzy spells and sometimes fainted. The Heidelberg physician whom they consulted, a distinguished professor of medicine, diagnosed the cause as weakness of the vascular nerves. This disability was a considerable psychological burden, and early made me conscious of the pressure of external conditions. I suffered all the more because my playmates and my two brothers were more robust than I, so that I felt inferior to them. In their rough and tumble way, they often made it clear that this was how they thought of me too. An inadequacy often calls forth compensating forces. In any case, these difficulties made me learn how to adjust better to the world of other boys. If I later showed some aptitude in dealing with difficult circumstances and troublesome people, I suspect that the gift can be traced back to my boyhood physical weakness. When we were taken out by our French governess, we had to be nattily dressed, in keeping with our social status. Naturally, we were forbidden to play in the city parks, let alone on the street. All we had for a playground was our courtyard, not much larger than a few of our rooms put together. It was surrounded by the backs of tall apartment houses. This yard contained 2 or 3 wretched plane trees, starved for air, and an ivy-covered wall. A mound of tufa rocks in one corner suggested a grotto. By early spring, a thick layer of soot coated the greenery, and whatever we touched was bent on transforming us into dirty, disreputable big city children. My favorite playmate before my school days was Frida Almendinger, the concierge's daughter. The atmosphere of sparse simplicity and the close-knit quality of a family living in crowded quarters had a curious attraction for me. I attended the primary grades at a distinguished private school where the children of leading families were taught reading and writing. After the sheltered environment, my first months in the public Oberrealschule, high school, amid rowdy fellow pupils, were especially hard for me. I had a friend named Quenza, however, who soon introduced me to all sorts of fun games. He also persuaded me to buy a soccer ball with my pocket money. This was a plebeian impulse which horrified my parents, all the more so since Quenza came from a poor family. I think it was at this time that my bent for statistics first manifested itself. We remained largely untouched by the currents stirring everywhere during the early 20s. In school, there could be no criticism of courses or subject matter, let alone of the ruling powers in the state. Unconditional faith in the authority of the school was required. It never even occurred to us to doubt the order of things, for as students we were subjected to the dictates of a virtually absolutist system. Moreover, there were no subjects such as sociology which might have sharpened our political judgments. Even in our senior year, German class assignments called solely for essays on literary subjects, which actually prevented us from giving any thought to the problems of society. Nor did all these restrictions in school impel us to take positions on political events during extracurricular activities or outside of school. One decisive point of difference from the present was our inability to travel abroad. Even if funds for foreign travel had been available, no organizations existed to help young people undertake such travel. It seems to me essential to point out these lacks, as a result of which a whole generation was without defenses when exposed to the new techniques for influencing opinion. At home, too, politics were not discussed. This was all the odder since my father had been a convinced liberal even before 1914. Every morning he waited impatiently for the Frankfurter Zeitung to arrive. Every week he read the critical magazines Simplicissimus and Jugend. He shared the ideas of Friedrich Naumann, who called for social reforms in a powerful Germany. After 1923, my father became a follower of Coudenhove-Kalergi and zealously advocated his pan-European ideas. Father would surely have been glad to talk about politics with me, but I tended to dodge such discussions, and he did not insist. This political indifference was characteristic of the youth of the period, tired and disillusioned as they were by a lost war, revolution, and inflation. But it prevented me from forming political standards, from setting up categories on which political judgments could be based. I was much more inclined to detour on my way to school across the park of the Heidelberg Schloss and to linger on the terrace, looking dreamily at the ruins of the castle and down at the old city. This partiality for tumble-down citadels and tangles of crooked old streets remained with me and later found expression in my passion for collecting landscape paintings, especially the works of the Heidelberg Romantics. On the way to the Schloss, I sometimes met the poet Stefan George, who radiated dignity and pride and a kind of priestliness. The great religious preachers must have had such an effect upon people, for there was something magnetic about him. When my elder brother was in his senior year, he was admitted to the master's inner circle. Music meant a good deal to me. Up to 1922, I was able to hear the young Furtwängler in Mannheim, and after him, Erich Kleiber. At that time I found Verdi more impressive than Wagner and thought Puccini frightful. On the other hand, I was ravished by a symphony of Rimsky-Korsakov and judged Mahler's Fifth Symphony rather complicated, but I liked it. After a visit to the playhouse, I observed that George Kaiser was the most important dramatist who, in his works, wrestles with the concept of the value and power of money. And upon seeing Ibsen's The Wild Duck, I decided that we could not find the characteristics of leaders of society as other than ridiculous. These people were farcical, I wrote. Romain Rolland's novel Jean Christophe heightened my enthusiasm for Beethoven. I recorded all the bad marks in the class book in my Phoenix calendar for school children, and every month counted up who had received the most demerits. No doubt I would not have bothered if I had not some prospect of frequently heading the list. The office of my father's architectural firm was right next door to our apartment. That was where the large renderings for the builders were made. Drawings of all sorts were made on bluish transparent paper, whose smell is still part and parcel of my memories of that office. My father's buildings were influenced by the Neo-Renaissance. They had bypassed a Junger still. Later on, the quieter classicism of Ludwig Hoffmann, the influential city architect of Berlin, served him as a model. In that office, I made my first work of art at the age of 12, a birthday present for my father. It was a drawing of a sort of allegorical life clock in a highly ornamented case complete with Corinthian columns and intricate scroll work. I used all the watercolors I could lay hands on. With the help of the office employees, I produced a reasonable facsimile of an object in late Empire style. Before 1914, my parents kept a touring car for summer use as well as a sedan for driving around the city in winter. These automobiles were the focus of my technological passions. At the beginning of the war, they had to be put upon blocks to spare the tires. But if the chauffeur were well disposed to us, we children were allowed to sit at the steering wheel in the garage. At such times, I experienced the first sensations of technical intoxication in a world that was yet scarcely technical. In Spandau prison, I had to live like a man of the 19th century, without a radio, television set, telephone or car, and was not even allowed to work the light switch myself. After 10 years of imprisonment, I experienced a similar rapture when I was allowed to run an electric floor polisher. In 1915, I encountered another product of the technical revolution of those decades. One of the Zeppelins used in the air raids on London was stationed in Mannheim. The captain and his officers were soon frequent guests in our house. They invited my two brothers and me to tour their airship. 10 years old, I stood before that giant product of technology, clambered into the motor gondola, made my way through the dim, mysterious corridors inside the hull, and went in to the control gondola. When the airship started, toward evening, the captain had it perform a neat loop over our house, and the officers waved a sheet they had borrowed from my mother. Night after night afterward, I was in terror that the airship would go up in flames, and all my friends would be killed. My imagination dwelt on the war, on the advances and retreats at the front, on the suffering of the soldiers. At night we sometimes heard a distant rumble from the great battle of attrition at Verdun. With the ardent sympathies of childhood, I would often sleep for several nights, running on the hard floor beside my soft bed in order to be sharing the privations of the soldiers at the front. We did not escape the food shortages in the city and what was then called the turnip winter. We had wealth, but no relatives or acquaintances in the countryside. My mother was clever at devising endless new variations on turnip dishes, but I was often so hungry that in secret I gradually consumed a whole bag of stone-hard dog biscuits left over from peacetime. The air raids on Mannheim, which by present-day standards were quite innocuous, became more frequent. One small bomb struck a neighbouring house. A new period of my boyhood began. Since 1905, we had owned a summer house in the vicinity of Heidelberg. It stood on the slope of a quarry that was said to have supplied the stone for the nearby Heidelberg Schloss. Back of the slope rose the hills of the Odenwald, with hiking paths through the ancient woods. Strip clearings provided occasional glimpses of the Neckar Valley. Here, everything was peaceful. We could have a fine garden and vegetables, and the neighbour owned a cow. We moved there in the summer of 1918. My health soon improved. Every day, even in snowstorms and rain, I tramped for 3/4 of an hour to and from school, often at a steady run. Bicycles were not available in the straitened early post-war period. My way to school led me past the clubhouse of a rowing association. In 1919 I became a member and for 2 years was coxswain of the racing 4s and 8s. In spite of my still frail constitution, I soon became one of the most diligent oarsmen in the club. At the age of 16, I advanced to stroke in the school shells and took part in several races. For the first time, I had been seized by ambition and was spurred to performances I would not have thought myself capable of. What excited me was more the chance to direct the crew by my own rhythm than the prospect of winning respect in the small world of oarsmen. Most of the time, we were defeated, to be sure, but since a team performance was involved, each individual's flaws could not be weighed. On the contrary, a sense of common action arose. There was another benefit to such training. the requirement of self-discipline. At the time, I despised those among my schoolmates who were finding their first pleasures in dancing, wine, and cigarettes. On my way to school at the age of 17, I met the girl who was to become my wife. Falling in love made me more studious. For a year later, we agreed that we would be married as soon as I completed my university studies. I had long been good at mathematics, but now my marks in other subjects also improved. I became one of the best in the class. Our German teacher, an enthusiastic Democrat, often read aloud to us from the liberal Frankfurter Zeitung. But for this teacher, I would have remained altogether non-political in school, for we were being educated in terms of a conservative bourgeois view of the world. In spite of the revolution which had brought in the Weimar Republic, it was still impressed upon us that the distribution of power in society and the traditional authorities were part of the God-given order of things. We remained largely untouched by the currents stirring everywhere during the early 20s. In school, there could be no criticism of courses or subject matter, let alone of the ruling powers in the state. Unconditional faith in the authority of the school was required. It never occurred to us to doubt the order of things, for as students we were subjected to the dictates of a virtually absolutist system. Moreover, there were no subjects such as sociology which might have sharpened our political judgments. Even in our senior year, German class assignments called solely for essays on literary subjects, which actually prevented us from giving any thought to the problems of society. Nor did all these restrictions in school impel us to take positions on political events during extracurricular activities or outside of school. One decisive point of difference from the present was our inability to travel abroad. Even if funds for foreign travel had been available, no organization existed to help young people undertake such travel. It seems to me essential to point out these lacks, as a result of which a whole generation was without defenses when exposed to the new techniques for influencing opinion.